All right. Well, thanks everybody for coming in, and I will do my best to keep within the time boundaries of about 30 minutes so we have time for some Q&A. I wanted to do this series because I think what I find is most helpful is talking with a certain frame for clients on how you sell group. And it's difficult to be very invested in the whole group process if you can't get the groups off the ground to begin with. So when it comes to the College Counseling Center world, that's like a skill that we have to continue to work on and improve within ourselves. And so I've gotten a lot of experience in doing that with clients and how to personalize the selling of that, specifically for them, as well as talking with different colleagues, both within the center and more recently in my private practice work and professional world. So, right. So why group? I mean, broadly speaking, like many clinical issues can be addressed in either group and individual. Group therapy has been shown to be as effective as individual therapy and is the preferred treatment for more interpersonal components. I love the idea of group because to me it feels as if it's like lightning in a bottle. And in a way, what I'll talk to clients about is if we're thinking about individual counseling as the way in which you're doing your insight work and your in-depth work of how you've become the way that you are, then group is the insight into action phase of how do you take what you are and then shift it to what you want to be or aspire to. So having the sense of confidence and belief that group is the best treatment option for the client's concern is going to directly impact their acceptance of a referral in that. So when we think about that, I want you to reflect on how maybe you've either talked about group or have group talk to you if you were ever in a position where it was offered. There are certain things that make this a bad sell. When you start speaking as if you're anxious about bringing it up, you're nervous about them rejecting the idea, and you kind of say it as a, well, there's this mindfulness group, which I think could be helpful for you if you're open to, just discussing a bit of your concerns, and maybe you'll learn some skills about it. You can already sense the dread that you have in just talking to that client about it. So when I talk about a good sell, and I'll give a rundown and a very quick vignette example of this towards the end, you're going to see that it's going to be very specific towards the individual person in mind, and you're going to customize it to be able to fit their specific needs. It's also not a one and done deal. And so I'm coming from the frame for a lot of this presentation from interpersonal process groups or Yalom style groups. But I think these ways in which you sell and customize how this fits your client's needs is something you can transpose across all kinds of specialty groups. And I know there's workshops and other things that people might be coming here for, trying to think about how they can sell that. So my hope is that you'll be able to take some of these skills and thoughts and tailor it to your specific needs in this. And the Q&A, maybe we can go into more depth with that. But I'd like you to think about it from the space of what's going to be the most effective way to make connections with this client. Is it going to be to come from an intellectual perspective, an emotional perspective, or more action-oriented perspectives? And that'll very much depend on their needs and concerns. But since we're talking about Yalom groups, I actually find this really helpful in terms of how you can think about the benefits of group therapy itself broadly, and just coming together as a space where people are connecting with one another. And his curative factors, I think, do give us a really nice guide for that. So I'm not going to go through all of them, although I think you could speak to all of them and how they can assist with it, but we're going to go through a couple and in some more detail here. So installation of hope. Group therapy works for everything, all the time. That's kind of the phrase and the attitude that I want you to take with this with clients. It's not a matter of doubt. You know this therapy modality is effective. You've either maybe seen it before, or you can hear it from the colleagues that talk to you who are really involved in the field. It can be life-changing. For me at the Counseling Center, we have at most 12 weeks of group therapy with a person, and I like to frame it from that sense of you can have a lifetime of change begin in just these 12 weeks. So being positive and optimistic when you're talking about group. Think about the idea of AA meetings, right? And how the whole idea of that is that people can see, the hope and the change of somebody who has been where they've been, And this is like the aspiration, you know, of you wanting to say, like, even though I'm in this really dark place, I know that there's another side to that. And you can tell just, you know, in terms of like faith healing and other places, that regardless of whatever settings you're in, groups can have a lot of curative factors as long as you have the hope and desire to, you know, kind of see a vision for yourself in the future that's more positive than your current circumstances. So it doesn't even necessarily have to have the therapeutic skills and backup that you all will have, but you can still have a positive effect by keeping true to that hope. So universality, am I alone in my wretchedness? Like, that's the kind of turmoil that a lot of us can feel. And the thing is that there's a lot of frightening and unacceptable problems that we have in our lives. We have thoughts, impulses, fantasies, some things that we, you know, maybe push away or like don't like to admit to ourselves or others. And so, you know, I usually ask this in chat rooms when I'm doing professional trainings, but for the sake of this like talk, I would say just think to yourself, what would you be most disinclined to share with a group? Like if you were in a process, open-ended, understanding yourself and others style group. And hold that in your mind for a second. And I'm just going to list what are the most common things that Yalom speaks to that he sees people coming in with. One is that they're basically incompetent and intellectually bluffing, and somehow you become the greatest con artist of all time because you've gotten to this point just by pure luck. There's some deep sense of interpersonal alienation, the sense that like you are one and unique in your suffering, and no one else will be able to connect or understand or relate to your circumstances. A feeling or a fear of not being able to connect with others or not wanting to connect with others. And then some variety of a sexual secret. So you may notice that yours kind of falls within some of these spectrums of these specific concerns. And to normalize even these with clients, I think can be really affirming as you're talking about, you know, how much social isolation in our current format and just isolation in general is one of the bigger parts of depression and how it keeps us stuck, right? It's like we have this very small window in which we can move if we stay at home, and there's not a lot of room for growth or improvement and connection. So group's going to be anxiety provoking, of course, but you allow yourself by having more of that vulnerability to be able to open yourself to those connections and to be a part of something greater than just yourself in that space. And as well, there's also a lot of cultural differences in disclosures, so just keep that in mind as we talk about this. So when we're talking about imparting information, direct advice that people give in groups, people are always going to give advice to one another, which is fine. And depending on the group that you're doing, like there might be support groups or, you know, kind of even AA and other style groups where that's kind of a large part of what you want members to do, to share their experiences and advice with one another. When it comes to process groups, it's reported that that's like the least helpful part of the group experience. And even if you think to yourself, like, what kind of advice have I gotten from friends that's really made like life-changing impact to me? Usually it's not a lot, right? There may be a circumstance or two where you can point to that, but rarely will one piece of advice make you shift your entire perspective. Most of the time, you'll get into this like mindset of, yeah, but you know, you don't quite understand the context of my family when you say that, or you don't really understand how I am and how that would be impossible for me to do the way you're phrasing it. And so it's very easy to dismiss advice. So this idea of like help rejecting complainer that we can see in groups, it gets stemmed by this consistent environment of advice giving that we can fall into. So it's not that you can't have any, but just to recognize that like as a way of selling group, you can give advice and that can be helpful for people to hear. That can be like an insightful like thing for them to, you know, take away as I can get different perspectives from this, while keeping them grounded in the idea that everyone in the group has their own subjective reality, right? We're not looking for an objective truth of a matter here or trying to play your life by a democracy of who thinks you're a good person or a bad person. The whole idea is to be curious and open to exploring different avenues of thought, but not necessarily to take that advice and say, this applies to me 100%, which I think, again, can be a nice way of framing it for them. So as we talk about altruism, I like this story that Yalom refers to in terms of the Hasidic story of hell and heaven. I'll butcher it a little bit, but essentially there's a priest that's taken into a room, and there's a large table, let's say like 9 feet across, and people all circled around with a bowl of soup in the middle. And they all have very long ladles that are like 8 feet long that they can reach and like take up a bit of the soup. But when they try and move it to themselves, they can't, because of the length of the spoon, move it into their mouths. And so you see them all starving and very skinny and perished. And he says, this is what hell looks like. And he says, now would you like to see heaven? And they go into the next room. It's the same setup, same large table, like 9 feet across, same ladles that are like 8 feet long. But instead of everyone starving, everyone looks plump and well-fed, and you notice everyone's feeding one another. And what I really like about that story is this idea that people have when they get into a negative headspace of anxiety and depression, that I'm not any good to myself. How can I be a help to others? And so I love that, because it's really great to be able to challenge this idea that you are a burden that comes up so much and have nothing to offer. I don't know about you all, but as a therapist who's been around for a little while, I don't think I have all my stuff figured out. And so normalizing that and getting this idea of, Yalom quotes a philosopher, which I will not do verbatim, that essentially is like, even the shackled can unchain others, which I really love. You know, there's a sense of we can all help each other in ways we may not be able to see. And you can still be a valuable part of this life. And if you also have had, let's say, a traumatic experience previously, or they've come from a very difficult family system, then you can even highlight the resilience in which they've had in previous parts of their lives, and how that could serve to be a model or something that you potentially already admire in your individual client, that you're wanting them to be able to demonstrate and show with the group. That, again, sense of personal fulfillment that we can get from being altruistic. We know there's a lot of research around doing good to others tends to make us feel good about ourselves. And so that can be a really helpful frame for it. So in the college counseling setting, I'll have people say things like, well, I can't learn anything from people who aren't the same age as me. So if they're non-graduate students, I'm not going to get anything out of it. But again, like, you think about that in terms of like just at an intellectual level, like, do they know more about this topic of, I don't know, engineering that I'm doing my PhD in? Yeah, you probably can't learn anything. But there's so many multifaceted aspects of life and of your interpersonal dynamics that the learning that you can take from a group of people is limitless in my mind. And for you to compartmentalize it to one aspect does a disservice to everyone else as a unique individual in that. So just, again, finding ways to push back on those thought processes. It's not to say that there isn't value in having a diversified, heterogeneous group where there's like more than just white identified individuals in the room, you know, because that can be difficult and bring a lot of dynamics in if it feels like I'm the only person of color or Black identified individual and no one else will understand my experience. That's a fair point to make. But with respect to some of these other points, I hope that gives you a sense of how you can shift this into the good that they can do for others. So this corrective recapitulation of the family group. So if we think about the group as a family system, then the whole idea is most people have different aspects of their family or interpersonal relationships in which they've been dissatisfied with throughout their lives. Even if it's not fully dysfunctional or abusive, there are parts of your life that you may feel at odds with, or you might hope to aspire to shift the way in which you're seen in that setting, right? You maybe see like you're not as assertive as you'd like to be, or you always seem to make awkward comments when you're in new social situations. Whatever that might be for the client, it can be useful to use the group as a way to correct that experience and allow us to challenge these narratives that we have. Narratives are a big thing for me in terms of like how we form all kinds of stories about who we are, both interpersonally, intrapersonally within ourselves, interpersonally, like how we interact with people in the world, as well as how we're seen in groups, like more as the group as a whole. And we do it all the time. Like, it's very innocuous in the way that it pops up. One common story that I like to refer back to is I had a client who was a young woman reflecting on a story about her parents when she was about 8 or 10, taking her to a restaurant. And she was offered by her parents, what would you like to eat for lunch? She's like, a hamburger, would you like a salad? And like any 8, 10-year-old, they said, oh, I'd like the hamburger. And her parents immediately kind of said like, okay, well, that's fine. If you want the hamburger, you can have it. But, the salad's probably going to make you feel a lot better. Like hamburgers tend to make you feel really bloated. And you may not fit as well in the clothes if you keep eating hamburgers all the time. So just, be considerate of that. And honestly, like salads usually have a lot of like benefit for you. And so whatever you'd like though, dear, like what would be good? And the, client kind of said, okay, I'll do the salad instead. Now, it can be a pretty innocuous statement, like to have that story like told out, but just think about what kinds of messages inherently could you take away from that experience. Maybe it's a sense of, I can't trust my decisions. I was given a decision and like obviously I picked wrong. I need to always rely on others, like instead of my own judgment. Fat is bad. And like I'm kind of internalizing this message of if I gain weight that this is not good and people will like be ashamed of me for it. This sense of fear when it comes to just decision making in general that can arise from this. And it's not like this is a one-off incident, right? This person didn't come into therapy and say, I think it all started when my parents told me to pick the salad or the hamburger, right? It's not that dramatic. But when you have these consistent and like, I think of it more as like the death from 1,000 small cuts approach in which these narratives begin to be reinforced and imbued in different settings and different situations and unconsciously, not necessarily something that you're aware of happening, but it becomes kind of a concrete fact and something that you believe in the world. And that can be something where we can shift, we can bring light to that, and bring awareness to what that is as it unfolds naturally in the group. Because one of the theories of group is that the way that you act outside in the world will inevitably play out the same way in the group setting. And so that family system that you're a part of, although it's very separate from you and you're not your same child self, there are still habits and tendencies and learned behaviors that are like concrete and that you maybe don't even recognize or you take for granted. So I want to give this other example just briefly of this client, Betty, who will bemoan the fact that she's not an individual where she can speak freely. She's irritated that like others are favored over her in this setting of group, and she has resentment towards the group members. And then just asking like, do you think this person's not a good fit for group? Like on a face value, it feels like, man, she's really unhappy with this. But if we're thinking about this in terms of like, what is this pattern that Betty is playing into and how has this potentially happened within her life previously or is currently happening in her relationships now? Whether it's a sense of never feeling enough compared to others or, really feeling like she isn't getting the attention she deserves and how she interacts with people is through anger as a way to express that instead of touching on some of the more soft personal feelings towards herself of feeling isolated or alone or abandoned. Like these can be all things in which you can allow Betty to shift the frame of what's happening so that she can get the connections and the like attention or care that she actually wants in the setting, but she's not quite able to get because of the way that she's been like brought up or the habits that she's learned over time. As well, just socialization techniques, I think, are something that's always going to be beneficial for people. So this idea, there was a client who came in and talked about how he was judging a science fair, and this was a very intelligent PhD student who was coming in and saying he had judged a science fair of maybe 5th graders, and as he had gone around the group telling the story, he was like, I walked up to their things and I had a list of notes of things that I was impressed with and things that I thought could be expanded upon, and gave like a really detailed pro-con analysis. And then later on in the science fair presentation, he overheard kids whispering like, look how he's the mean judge. And it's something that just caught him completely off guard, right? And it's a little exaggerated example, but there are things in which we're never going to be completely cognizant of that other people can see in us. And us being able to get that feedback from individuals is going to be immensely helpful in this. The idea of eye contact, culturally specific, because that can mean different things for different cultures, but it can be really useful to recognize how that plays into the way that you view yourself and others. For me, Personally, I didn't realize, honestly, until probably a couple of years ago when my wife pointed out, when we're at restaurants or when we're like ordering coffee somewhere, you never look at the person when you're talking to them, you always look down. And I never really thought about it. But there was something about that that felt intimidating or scary to me that I didn't quite like understand at the time. And just having that like noted to me made me almost want to challenge myself to be like, why am I feeling so like anxious about being perceived as like maybe needy or asking too much of the waiter to like get the order correct next time or something, where I would kind of like shut down if I needed to like say something that would be contrary to what's being talked about in the setting. So talking about facts as opposed to feelings, in the group, you're going to notice that people tend to always rely on facts because it's very safe and simple. And we're taught to do it naturally. We're a very intellectual, group as humans. So being able to focus more on your affects and what's actually coming up for you emotionally. This both means emotionally in terms of the feelings that you can name, but even the body sensations that are associated with those emotions. So I tend to see that people don't recognize that when they, let's say, hear a compliment. This is a very common one. Like a lot of clients will say they can't take compliments and they don't know why. But if you ask them, and maybe you give them a compliment because you really do like part of them and what they've been talking about, and you like the person they are, I would ask you to like challenge them to be curious and really focus in on what part of your body do you feel shifting as I give you that compliment right now. Maybe it's a tension in your stomach, maybe it's a heavy weight in your shoulders, like a sinking sensation. And then being able to derive from that, what emotion could that be? And having them kind of expand their vocabulary to not just think, I am my thoughts, but you are a multifaceted person that is both influenced by your thoughts, but also by the sensations that occur automatically in your body that lead to an affect, that lead to a thought, that probably reinforce a narrative that you've had previously in life. So just being, also aware of other things group can assist with in terms of how responsive you are to others and what maybe stops you from being responsive in other ways, how you adjust to conflict. Even if you're not involved in an angry, conflicting group, the idea of like what would make you interject or what stops you from interjecting can be something you can be curious about and observe, and again, challenge the idea that if I step in, I'm going to make it worse, right? If that's, again, another narrative that you've identified in yourself. And overall, just allows for less judgment and allows you to have more accurate empathy with others. So imitative behavior, this idea of, clients tending to imitate the therapist at first because we're the teacher role when we first start groups. So being aware of that, but also directing people to learn from one another, right? And I like the idea of mentalizing in these kinds of groups in which you can almost ask your clients to be curious about what is it that you think X person is experiencing right now as they're being kind of chided by this other member. Like, how do you think what's going on in this dynamic between the new members? Or what would it be like for you to think about being assertive with your mother? Like, who would you want to act like? Who in the group do you respect as an assertive person in the space? And even if they can't emulate that person completely, which I wouldn't expect them to, it can still be a nice way of them practicing, like, how can I embody this part of this person that I really love and really connecting with, and take that into myself, use that as a tool for me to move forward with my life in the way that I want to. And then I have this note of snakes as vicarious or spectator therapy. So at the counseling center that we're at now, before COVID and all that, we have a staff member who really enjoys putting plastic snakes everywhere around it. And I mean like everywhere, like you open a drawer and there's a snake that's like held on by a string. And it understandably makes people very nervous and like, kind of scares them in that way. And so I think about that in terms of the anxiety and the, fear that first comes when that first happens to you, and how after a while, unless we have like a new staff member or new trainees, like really we're all just used to it. And it's almost like a nonchalant, like, yeah. And you put the snake back up on the shelf where it was supposed to be. And it's just interesting to think about how like exposure just in and of itself is a curative factor, right? And so by being able to be in a space in which conflict is both talked about openly and then actually resolved in a way that it would never be resolved in your family system or handled differently, is a space for you to not feel so much fear and intensity when you're faced with that within your job, within your own relationships, romantic or otherwise. So just thinking again about how you can use that as a benefit, as a laboratory or testing ground for people. And so again, we've kind of highlighted these points, so I'll skip through it just to make the best use of time. So for the pre-group meeting, this is how we set things up both in the College Counseling Center realm as well as within my private practice. So I like to have pre-group appointments for people because I really like to set expectations for group therapy. You can do this differently. You could take aside the last half of your session individually with them if they're open to that, to be able to have these meetings. But I would encourage you to do one of those two options because it's really important to set a strong frame and foundation for clients to understand what they're getting into. So in this kind of space, you're wanting to assess how they're going to benefit from group therapy and if they'll be overly disruptive to the group. You want to increase their motivation, clarify goals that they have, interpersonal, if that's the kind of group you're doing, communicate your expectations, and increase their ability to succeed in this group and not feel shocked at the environment. I like to think of this for my style of groups to commit to at least 4, because I explain it as you're going to normalize your anxiety in the first 2, although you're going to be encouraged to speak, and I don't let people stay silent forever by any means. But it allows them some visualization, I think, to say, okay, I don't have to let everything out the first time. By the time they're in the 3rd and 4th session, they should start to really both understand the benefit of group therapy in their ways, as well as feel connected to specific individuals in the group. So there's almost a buy-in of, I'm excited to see this person again. And then I'll often do a role play for the pre-group meeting with them. So let me just go to this next slide really quick. So this is just a brief outline in which, I kind of have proposed for people, and you can modify this as you see fit. I like to think of how you're going to talk about the installation of hope. Group is an effective modality, being honest and direct with your feelings in group and expressing thoughts and feelings towards the self and others in the here and now. That's, again, the process style groups that I like to run most. Talking about group as a laboratory, explaining expectations, confidentiality, attendance rules. If it's a rolling attendance group where new people will be added, or if it's closed, it's going to stay the same for however long you're planning to run it. As well as common stumbling blocks. So preempt their fears about expressing negative positive feelings and the feeling of frustration or annoyance with the therapist that will almost certainly come up at some point. The tendency to withdraw emotionally when you try a new behavior. You can kind of describe these natural patterns that we see happen in groups to make it not feel so off-putting when it does occur. I really like, again, the last part of this would be to really talk about how people are able to, talk about themselves and say, what do you think you can get out of this group process? So one of the things that I'll leave us with as we wrap up my 30 minutes very quickly is that it's important to understand where the client is coming from, and again, to customize the specific situations that you're describing in a group to be able to have them gain an understanding of how this is going to be useful for them. One common vignette that I like to use with clients, and I find this really great because it's a little of a Rorschach, because there's a lot of ways in which you can take this particular vignette. So I often will say that there's a, let's say you're in group therapy. I'm just going to paint a picture for you really quick so that you can see what it's like, and then you can respond on how you'd act in this. You're in group. You have a young woman there who's talking about a partner that she's been with, that she's struggling in the relationship with. She says things like, I'm just really frustrated at my partner. He constantly, agitates me with wanting to know where I am, and it's becoming, almost too much. He will ask me what I'm doing throughout the day. It's pre-COVID, by the way, different now. But he'll constantly ask to check in on me and say where am I going later tonight? And I'll say I'm planning to study with a couple of people in the library, and he'll say, well, are there going to be any guys there? And I'm like, yeah, there's maybe one of the 5. And then he starts saying I don't know, I'm kind of worried about you being unsafe. If you're going to stay there really late, I don't think you should be there with guys. And I've never given him a reason to think that I would be in interested in infidelity or anything with him. We've been faithful to each other. So I really don't understand what his problem is with this. But I told him he's being ridiculous, and he says things like, well, if you really recognize that I'm just trying to care about you, and I just feel really annoyed. Like, I don't know what else to do with this relationship. I feel like it's getting to the point where it's not even worth it. So I'll say, let's just call that woman Lindsay, for example. So if Lindsay was in the group and just said that, group members might jump in. They might just start talking about their thoughts, their emotions, the responses that they had come up in them. But if there was a pause, I might throw out to the group, how are people feeling towards Lindsay in this situation? And whatever that client says in this role play, like whatever they choose to respond with, most of the time it's advice giving, like saying, oh, I think you should leave. Or, maybe your partner is just worried about you, or have you talked to him? They start asking questions about them. Whatever it is, usually it's not an emotion. And so you can just kind of say, okay, so you're asking questions and you're, saying that she should break up with her partner. What I might do differently in this group is ask you, instead of the advice giving, or instead of just saying that outright, like you would with a supportive friend, which makes sense that you want to help this person get better and not feel annoyed. I'd ask you, like, what are you feeling in this moment towards her? Like, what is the emotion that you experience as you hear a story about someone in this dynamic? Maybe it's anger towards the partner. Maybe it's concern towards yourself as far as like not being listened to or you not saying the right thing. But whatever it is, like just think about what emotions came up for you in that story. And I like to do the duality of both the emotion you're feeling towards another person as well as how you feel about yourself talking about this. Because when you give advice, naturally you're going to feel some way about that. Maybe you're nervous about being taken out of context and offending a person. And then on another level, I'd say, so that's great that you can speak to those emotions. And also what might happen in group is you might find Lindsay kind of dismissive of you. Like you may have observed her in other situations in the group prior to this where she's been very much quick to write people off or not taking into consideration how they might be nervous or feeling towards them. And that might be part of what she's struggling with, is how do I feel connected when I take someone's concern overtly as an attack on my credibility, like thinking that I'm like interested in cheating on somebody. But it also could be that, she's in this abusive relationship. And so all these different views can be very valid. And again, it's not about finding the truth in this moment, but it's about how you interact in this moment and how that can parallel what you experience in your own life. Maybe you connect to Lindsay's story in a way, maybe you identify with a partner, but just trying to, again, give a small picture of the complexity that can unfold in just a brief group moment. And lastly, we don't have a lot of time about this, but I think we could do even more in depth on this. As you sell to colleagues, and I've done this both in an internal network at the counseling center as well as like externally with different private practice practitioners, I'd like you to think about who's in your professional network out in private practice. How can you expand and diversify that to engage with different types of clinicians that might be interested in your type of group that you're curious about? Being able to reach out, and if it is something that you can demo for them, offering a taste of that service can be really wonderful, both for their clinicians to be able to have the language on how to sell it to people, as well as, for them to benefit from your own expertise. So being able to demonstrate that expertise within professional settings, organizations, and then discussing how you can utilize your group as a supplement for treatment goals, not as a replacement. I think a lot of the fear that we have in this community, in private practice realm at least, is an underlying fear with, not being able to, losing our client, right, to a group. But I think groups can serve very different purposes, and it obviously depends on what you all are thinking individually about your own group. But I would challenge you to think about how you can frame your group in a way to say, like, if I'm given this space to delve deeply into my trauma within the group, then you, an individual, can focus on the current circumstances and how this is playing in their family life. Or maybe you can address the substance use more specifically and dig into that. Again, we know that having a dual modality like group and individual simultaneously tends to increase efficacy of people's development. And so I think ultimately that's all what we want, is for people to be able to get the most out of therapy. And so making group feel like an ally to that as opposed to something that has to be contrarian to it is the work that I want us all to think about how we do within our professional settings. But that is it for me.